On Aristotle B. Hall essay says, regardless of what one may think of Plato's critical theories, it must be admitted that he formulated many of the major problems of literary criticism, and it is to his credit too that it was his pupil Aristotle who gave, in the opinion of most future critics, the best answers to the questions Plato had raised. By the time Aristotle turned his mind to the analysis of literature, the future of Athens, with which Plato was so concerned, had already been decided. Henceforth, she was to be a second rate power. Political and social problems could no longer have the urgency that they had had in Plato's time. This enabled Aristotle to consider more calmly the questions that had agitated his teacher. Poetry has two reasons for being. First, man is an imitative animal and takes pleasure in imitation. We have evidence of this in the facts of experience. Objects which in themselves we view with pain, we delight to contemplate when reproduced with minute fidelity, such as the forms of the most ignoble animals and of dead bodies. The cause of this again is that to learn gives the liveliest pleasure, not only to philosophers but to men in general, whose capacity, however, of learning is more limited. Equally natural and pleasant to man is the second reason for poetry, harmony and rhythm. For Plato, the pleasure that comes from imitation and rhythm could be dangerous and undermine the civic virtues. Aristotle does not discuss the contention for the moment. At this point in his argument, he only wants to show that it is natural to imitate and to get pleasure from imitation. Aristotle follows his master in being believing that the higher the subject matter, the higher the type of poem. The graver spirits imitated noble actions and the actions of good men. The more trivial sort imitated the actions of meaner persons, at first composing satires as the former did hymns to the gods and the praises of famous men. From a modern point of view, this seems to contradict the view he has just expressed that pleasure comes from the quality of imitation, regardless of the object imitated. It is perhaps a hangover from the austere scorn of Plato. This may account for the fact that Aristotle dismisses comedy in a word or two as an imitation of characters of a lower type, not, however, in the full sense of the word bad, the ludicrous being merely a subdivision of the ugly. Aristotle's major interest is in tragedy, which he defines as an imitation of an action that is serious, complete, and of certain magnitude, in language embellished with each kind of artistic ornament, the several kinds being found in separate parts of the play, in the form of action, not of narrative through pity and fear, effecting the proper purgation, catharsis of these emotions. The famous definition has exercised the minds of many men, some of whom are frank enough to admit that the feeling they have at the end of a great tragedy is not akin to the feeling of having been purged of these emotions. No doubt, Aristotle felt that he had to answer Plato's charge that drama aroused emotion in men's hearts and was therefore capable of making them more emotional and rash and less rational. He hit upon the idea of claiming that tragedy purges us of emotions. He would have been on better ground if he had claimed, in accord with his emphasis on form, that the true tragedy gives form to our emotions and thus controls them, making of them something far removed from the dangerous, uncontrolled emotions Plato feared. The idea of form is Aristotle's greatest contribution to literary criticism. Unlike Plato, who identified poetry with its subject matter, he sees that the difference between a tragedy and life is that a tragedy has beginning, a middle, and an end, and that each part ideally has a relation to every other part. This might be called logical form, but there is an ethical form too. The tragic hero is a man who is not eminently good and just, yet whose misfortune is brought about not by vice or depravity, but by some error or frailty. He must be one who is highly renowned and prosperous. A person is like Oedipus or other illustration men of such families. Thus, the tragic hero has a flaw, even if it is not his fault, and when he falls into bad fortune, our sense of justice is not shocked. This dovetails with the emotional form we mentioned when speaking of the effect of tragedy. That the hero must be of great family was believed not only by Aristotle but by most critics and playwrights down to our own day. This emphasis on form enables him to answer Plato's slander that the poet is mad. The art of poetry is the art of the gifted man rather than the madman. For the poet must enter into the nature of his character's sufferings and feel their distress and anger before he can imitate them. No man who is beside himself with madness can do so. Aristotle is careful to answer all of Plato's important attacks as to the charge that the poet tells lies and errs when, for instance, he describes a chariot race less correctly than a charioteer. Aristotle contends that the standard of what is correct is not the same in the art of poetry as it is in the art of life or any other art. The only error that is important occurs when the poet fails because he lacks imitative ability. But if he makes a mistake about medicine or something in any other profession, it is not a poetic error. In other words, Aristotle answers the Socrates of Ion in the way Ion himself should have answered. The purpose or end of poetry is not the same as the purpose of the man who teaches chariot racing. Aristotle is also careful to answer Plato's metaphysical objection that the poet, in imitating the object, which is merely an imitation of the ideal, is too removes from the truth. He points out that poetry is more universal than things as they are. It is not the function of the poet to relate what has happened, but what may happen, what is possible according to the law of probability or necessity. Thus, he makes his famous distinction between history and poetry. The historian writes of what has already happened, the poet writes of what could happen. Poetry, therefore, is a more philosophical and a higher thing than history, for poetry tends to express the universal, history the particular. Thus, It is that in poetry a probable impossibility is more acceptable than an incredible possibility. This implies that the poet, rather than merely imitating things in nature, as Plato said he did, actually attains nearer to the ideal. For Aristotle insists poets present things not as they are but as they should be. This emphasis on the universal, though primarily intended as an answer to Plato, is implicit in Aristotle's whole view of literature.